talking about session 3, which is looking at data specifically from the ArtsEd data projects. We'll be building quite a bit on our session 2, where we talk more generally about charts and graphs and chart interpretation. Now we're going to be looking at some data, mostly from the state of Washington. I've borrowed a lot of screenshots from your all's dashboards. I do want to make sure I stay upfront here that these data are still in review. The Washington ArtsEd dashboards are not yet released for production for the general public. So what we're showing you today is kind of a preliminary look at that data. So I would definitely not recommend making any decisions based on that data, or maybe don't share it widely. I know this is being recorded, so we're happy to share what we have in progress, but do just want to acknowledge that it's not completely final yet. And with that, let's go ahead and get started with our session. So last time I challenged those of you who were able to attend to find a chart that interested you. Maybe you hadn't seen that type of chart before, or maybe it's something that was really important to you, or maybe it's something that really confused you, whatever that might be. So I was wondering if anybody was able to do that exercise and wanted to talk about it, or maybe just wanted to mention a chart that you have encountered recently. Like you're all thinking on that for a minute.
Well, I just got a little glimpse into the data release, and I got to see the splot chart, which was really helpful, and to see how the movement on the chart was happening. And it was really cool to be able to see the different charts and graphs and know how to read them. So that was really cool.
Great. Anyone else want to share something? Looks like no. That's okay. We will see lots of charts today.
Stuff I just can't remember right now.
Understandable. I see a lot of charts in my day-to-day too, and some of them stick out with me and some are less memorable. Well, we will show you some charts today. Maybe one of these will become your favorite. So this is session 3 of our series. So today we'll be talking, as I said, about the ArtsEd data in particular, mostly Washington data. And then our last session next week will be about critical thinking, biases that we bring to data interpretation, and some of the ways that people can build charts poorly, whether on purpose or inadvertently, which can lead people to misunderstanding it. So that'll be a fun session too. But today is all about ArtsEd. So last time we talked about some of these more common chart types that you are likely to encounter in the wild, whether that be social media or news or your work, for example. Many of these we actually use in the ArtsEd data project. So I've crossed off the ones that we do not use in ArtsEd, but we're going to look at some of these in the context of ArtsEd today. So we'll start with our friend, the bar chart. So this is an example from our No Arts dashboard, from the Washington dashboard, where we're looking at schools and students who do not have access to the arts. So I know you all are particularly interested in equity issues. Obviously, if there are students who are in a school that don't even offer the arts, they do not have the opportunity to participate. And that doesn't really seem fair to those students. They don't even have that opportunity. So I want you to take a look at this chart. This is a stacked bar chart, and see if you can answer the question I have at the top there. So this is looking at school level eligibility for free and reduced lunch, or meals, I should say. And so the 4 categories are the proportion of students who are eligible. So low means very few students in that school, less than 25% are eligible. Mid-low is 25 to 50, and so on up to 75% and higher. So those are our 4 groups. Now, which of those groups has the highest proportion of no art schools that do not offer the arts? Feel free to put that in the chat, which I am looking at, or go ahead and just call it out. Give you a little bit of time to think on that. So remember our data literacy skills that we talked about in session 1. First, you've got to figure out where in this chart am I supposed to be looking, that location skill. So how do I know which part of this chart tells me that it's without arts? So you might want to look for the color legend. In this case, it's in word form.
So the orange is without, right? Because
right.
it says without in orange. So that gives me an indication that I'm looking at the orange. So I would say it is the 41%. Is that right?
Yeah. It is. Yeah. So even though it's a smaller part of a graph height-wise, That is the highest proportion. You'll see the screenshot made it a little hard to read these labels. So I added my own. So hopefully that helped too. So yes, that is correct. It's the 41% in the high group. So the students who attend the schools where most of their peers are eligible for free reduced price lunch are also the students who are in schools that do not have access to the arts. Interesting relationship there. Well, let's take this same chart and let's ask a completely different question of it. So now if I said of two of these groups, the mid, high, and the high, which of these has more schools without the arts? Is it the same answer or is it a different answer?
Different.
I sense some hesitation here, but you are correct.
Okay, good.
Yeah, so this chart actually lets us look at the data in a couple of different ways. So the stacked part of the bar is adding up to 100%. It's the total within a group. But the height of the bars is about the number of schools. So we can see that of the two groups that I gave you to choose from, although this is a smaller proportion, the 23% versus the 41, it's a taller orange section, meaning more schools don't have the arts. So we often try to do this in the ArtsEd data project where we know people have different questions of the data and a different way that they're trying to look at the data, maybe different questions they have. And so we try to provide you ways to answer things in more than one way within the same chart. And this is an example of that, where you can look at counts as well as percents and get, in this case, two different answers depending on what that question is. Here's another example of a bar chart. This one's a side-by-side bar chart. And now we're looking at representation in terms of school majority, race, ethnicity. So what we have here are, in the gray bars, the distribution of the students regardless of arts participation. Just looking at the schools in the state of Washington for whom we receive data. And remember, again, this is preliminary data. What does that breakdown look like? So for example, 26.7% of the students are in a Black majority school, meaning 50% or more of the students in their school are Black. The orange are students without the arts. And so by putting these side by side, we can see if we have representation or equal representation based on how you would expect it to be because of the data. So I do have the note here. These ones are not from Washington. We'll take a look at yours in just a second. But what do you think the answer to this question is? Would you say there is good representation there? I should say equal representation there?
No.
That was a definitive no. I agree. Yes. If there were, all the bars would look like this Black category, where the proportion of students is about the same as the proportion who don't have arts. It's about what you would expect. It matches the population. But look what happens with this no majority group. So no majority means no one racial or ethnic group was large enough to be 50% or more of the students. Therefore, it's a very diverse school. And in those schools, which are only 35.4% of the population, it's 61.8% of our students who don't have the arts. So those students are overrepresented and not having arts access. Now check this question here in the chat. Will respondent N of school that participated in each of the areas? Yeah, you're right. We do not have the count of schools here. We just have the proportion of students in each of these groups.
Even comparing though the no majority category and the white school dominant category, those are both in the, low mid 30s. And in the white dominant schools, there are only, am I reading this right? There are only 9-ish% of those students that don't have arts access. Whereas in the schools where there is no majority, 62% have no arts access. So that's a really big difference.
It's a big difference. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify slightly. So it's of the students who don't have arts access, which of these schools do they fall into? So the gray bars add up to 100.
Okay.
Yeah, and so do the orange. So we're saying that 9% of the students who don't have arts, I'm sorry, of the students who don't have arts access, 9% are in a white majority school, but 32% of the students are in those schools. So the students in white schools generally do have the arts.
Yeah.
Students in very diverse schools generally do not.
Yep. Okay. That's a much clearer way to phrase it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is an example where we don't have good representation. But if we look at the data from Washington State, this is actually one of the best I've seen. We have a lot of states participating in this project, and this is one of the most equal representations I have seen. So well done on that Washington. Not to say that there aren't equality issues elsewhere. This is state level, so you may still see some differences at a particular district or in a particular county or something like that. But at least looking across your state, these proportions look pretty equal, about what you would expect based on the population. So this is a pretty powerful graph. This is, as I said, on the No Arts dashboard for your state, which hopefully we'll be releasing in the very near future, so you can all really dig into this on your free time, right? When you just want to go look at ArtsEd data. So one more bar chart here. These ones are also not from Washington State, because this is from one of our 2 states that gave us student level data. So in session 1, when we talked about data granularity, I said that if we have really granular data down to the student level, we can do a lot more with it and answer deeper questions. So here's an example of that. This is one of our states where we know not just the characteristics of the students in the schools they're in, but also of the students themselves. And what we're able to do is pick different characteristics. In this case, I selected 6th through 8th graders. You can tell because that bar is darker. I've selected Black or African-American students. I've selected students who are not eligible for free or reduced price lunch. So we know those 3 things about these students. And then you can see what does that look like for that subgroup of students on these other characteristics. So for example, those who are also English learners, they have these 3 characteristics and they're English learners, 59% of those participate in the arts in at least one course. Whereas if they're not English learners, it's 70%. So that's a pretty big difference as well. Or you see a very similar pattern with special education. Our Black, not free and reduced lunch eligible, 6th through 8th grade students who are in special education programming, only about half of them participate in the arts versus 72% if they are not in those programs. So with this dashboard, which our student level states provide, you can mix and match all these different combinations and really get a deep look at what does arts participation look like among these different combinations of students. Very powerful. Unfortunately, we don't have those data yet for Washington, but hopefully you all are on the path to be able to provide those in the future, because then you'll be able to answer a lot of questions with those data. But let's switch over to line charts. So here we're looking at back to school level race ethnicity. So not of the individual students, but the majority of students in the schools in which they attend. And we've got a couple of different lines for different groups, and we've got a couple of different time points. So given that graph, which of those groups did not show an increase in arts enrollment for 2021? A little bit of chart interpretation. You'll need to locate 2021. You'll need to figure out, how do I know if it has increased or not? And then you need to find the group that did not show that increase. Anybody have a guess?
Other.
I hear some more hesitancy there. That's why we're learning, right? Yes, it is other. So the difference from 2020 to 2021, if the line goes kind of angling up and to the right, that would be an increase, because this axis is increasing numbers the higher you get. So this purple line went up, this line up, up, up. Some of it was pretty modest, like this line isn't a big increase, but it's a little bit of one. But then you've got this golden color where it went from way up here in 2020 down to here in 2021, a decrease.
I was looking at the no majority, the Hispanic, where it kind of curves. It's not necessarily dipping. It's just mostly just, leveling off. So I don't know if, as interpretation, it leveling off, would I round up or round down, or just keep it as is? Does that make sense? Would I consider that going down?
I would say if it increases at all, it's still an increase, even if it's a very slight one. So the difference here for the white line of 2020 to 2021 might only be a percentage point or 2, but it's still a higher value. So that is still an increase. This is very clearly a decrease from, it looks like about 68% or so to maybe around 58. If in the real dashboards, the live interactive versions, you can actually hover over these data points and see what those values are. You don't have to just use the axis. I was mostly wanting to point out the trend here. Now, the point I want to make with this chart is, if you see a pattern like this, where this group decreased, it's probably really tempting to think that these students stopped participating in the arts, right? The proportion of students who are in a other majority school, it was 68% participation, and now it's, let's just call it 55. Those students quit participating, but that's not necessarily what's happening here. So we think back to our data literacy skill of analysis and wanting to ask deeper questions and keep interrogating the data. One thing you might realize is that we're talking about school level characteristics. So it's not that the students themselves are other race ethnicity, it's that the schools they're in are. So an alternative explanation here could be that the same students continue to participate, but other students joined their school or left their school, which changed the categorization their school is in. So the schools that count towards other in this year may not be the same list of schools that count towards other in this year. That categorization is reassessed every single year, depending on the makeup of the students in the school in that year. So a school may be majority white in one year and majority Black in the following year if the student who entered or left the school building changed the overall proportion. I know it's a little bit to wrap your head around, but I want to start planting the seed that it's tempting when you see a chart like this to run with the first explanation you think of, but without querying the data further and asking more questions and thinking more deeply about it, that might not be what's actually driving this pattern. It may have nothing to do with the students at all and everything to do with just changing membership in these schools, not about their arts participation. So hopefully that was helpful. Do not know the N of what the percentages represent. That's right. We don't know how many students we're talking about, but the arts participation rate is what we're looking at here.
I really appreciate you saying that, Jen, too, because with gentrification, you know, in different neighborhoods, that really will shift who is enrolling in that district and that school. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It may be the students, right? I'm not saying that that explanation has been ruled out either. Perhaps some of those students did stop taking the arts. It's probably a combination of factors, some student level factors, some school level factors, maybe just the way the reporting was submitted. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end, that all of this is predicated on receiving good data. And if some districts or schools didn't report accurately, then we might be getting a misleading picture. So just wanted to make the point that the simplest explanation is may or may not be, or I should say the most obvious explanation may or may not be the correct or the only explanation or interpretation.
Jen, would another option be if the school itself had removed one or more of its arts offerings? So not the students themselves choosing to unenroll, but I know here in Spokane a while ago, we had an issue where most of our elementary schools in a certain district had their arts program canceled. And so there was a lot of shuffling and trying to just get, you know, one art session to the kids every once in a while, or get the elementary teachers to incorporate more arts just in their general classroom. So is that another possibility that would show in that same way?
Yeah, I think that's a great example. So the students, right, they may not have chosen not to be in the arts, but the option was no longer available to them, and therefore the rate of participation is lower. Nothing the students did about that. The school took it away from them. Yes, definitely a possibility.
In that case, funding. So cool. Thank you.
Great example of that analytic skill of thinking, what else could this be? Perfect. All right. And we'll just do a little bit more line charts here. So now we're looking at that school level free reduced lunch eligibility again. So now we've got our 4 groups. And now what would you say is noticeable about the trend for these groups, or what stands out to you? And these are all schools in Washington, at least the ones that we received data for. Public and charter. Not private, but public and charter. I don't believe we got data for private schools. Is there a group whose pattern looks different? Okay, they're all rising. Basically, they are. Yes, in general, they have all increased pretty noticeably from where they were in 2018 to 2022. I think that is a nice takeaway summary finding for the chart as a whole. That's great.
Yeah, but mid to low had an inverse experience in 2020, whereas the others all dipped and then came back upwards. The mid to high free reduced lunch group continued rising and then only declined the year after.
Right.
That seems peculiar.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Here, but
Everyone,
why would that one group have such a different path through COVID?
mhm. Great question. And similar to our race ethnicity groups, is it even about the students themselves, or is it about the makeup of the school? We do know that eligibility criteria for who qualifies for free reduced price lunch changed during COVID. That basically they said everybody's eligible. Let's make free reduced price lunch available. And so part of it might just be, the way people submitted the applications or didn't, maybe the way the school reported that. So many possibilities that might explain that. Again, maybe having nothing to do with the students themselves, but rather something to do with the school or the data, the way it was reported, and so on. Good, that stood out to me too. All right, let's move on to maps. So last time we talked about point maps, where we've got a dot or another symbol on a map of where something is geographically located, or we have these choropleth or filled maps where the entire geographical area has been filled in. So here we're looking at the arts enrollment rate by county in Washington. And I want you to use your data literacy skills to try to estimate or approximate, what do you think the value is for this county that I've selected here? In the dashboard, you'd be able to hover over it and get that value. But there's enough cues here that I think you could probably get pretty close. And I'd like to hear how you go about doing that.
You would definitely follow like the color scale and see how the tone of the color is deepening or lightening, and that will give you your variable.
Yes, the color legend is a great place to start. That is what I would recommend too. So you might notice that although we're talking about proportions, which means the value could be as high as 100%, you can see from the color scale, our data don't actually go up through 100%. So we're only talking about kind of an abbreviated part of the scale, this 2 to 71. So halfway from 2 to 71, yeah, perfect. So yeah, that's what I would do too, is I would think, all right, well, if I'm dealing from 2 to 71, halfway is around 35, somewhere in there. So if 35 is kind of this grayish color, and this is a little bit more of a blue, I'd put it somewhere a little higher than that. That 40, I see some guesses at 40. Yeah, somewhere in there. I think the actual value is 39. So you're very, very close. So I just wanted to prove to you that even without being given the exact value, you have the skills to be able to figure out some of those things based on some logic, right? That's not the full amount. And then even if you have a little trouble matching the exact colors, you get the sense that it's not quite midpoint. It's a little bit higher than that. So very well done. The other thing I want to point out about maps, I talked about this a little bit last time in session 2, how even though you might have data that's a geographical unit, like a district or a county or something like that, you may not necessarily want to represent it in map form. But the reason you might want to see it in map form or show it in map form is for things like this, where you can see, do we have some sort of pattern happening in our state? So if this were just a list of counties with their arts enrollment rate, you could see that this one was the lowest and you could see this one was on the lower side. But would you necessarily be able to realize that these kind of cluster together? All of these lower but not lotest counties are kind of all up here in this part of the state together. A map makes that really easy to see that. And it's harder to see that in other other graph types, whereas the map makes that really apparent. Now, if you did see a pattern like this in your state or in Washington's data, what are some things you might want to follow up with? What else might you want to know? What analysis questions would you ask in order to better understand this trend that you're seeing here? There's somebody's taking an action item to try to recruit some more in the central and northern area. That's great.
I do think you've brought up a good reminder a few times that sometimes this could be maybe due to people who aren't reporting. I mean, sadly, I know for many years when I was teaching an art class, our school just didn't report it. So that could be the case. But I see lots of other really great ideas coming in the chat too. So I'll switch back to them.
Yeah. Why are we seeing this pattern? Of course, you see a pattern, it interests you. You want to know why it's there. Is it something to do with the demographics there, accessibility? One thing you might want to wonder about is, Does that low arts enrollment rate mean that the students have access to the arts and choose not to participate? Or do they not have access to the arts? Those are kind of different questions, right? So one thing you might want to do is pop over to the no arts dashboard in the Washington dashboards and see where are those no arts schools located. So everywhere you see a dot, now we have our dot maps as well, is a school that does not offer the arts at all. And if we kind of picture the same region here as we see here, yeah, there do look like there are quite a few schools that don't even offer the arts. So maybe that's a big part of the problem, is that there are very few schools that do offer the arts to counteract these ones that don't. Now that would be the next question, right? Where are the schools that do, and what are the enrollment rates at the school level, not just the county level? And you can see it's not the whole story either, because there's a lot of no arts schools clustered in this area, and yet that overall enrollment rate is still pretty good. So that might be down to maybe the size of the school. If you've got a bunch of smaller schools that don't have the arts, but a bunch of larger schools that do with good participation, those smaller schools kind of get washed out in that overall county average. So there's so much depth to a big summary number like the county level rate that doesn't really tell you the whole story. You'd probably want to know more about what does this look like at the school level, and what is this like the count of schools that are affected with having arts or not having arts. So it's usually just step one is to see a chart and see the pattern. And then probably step two is, what else can I find out about this to better understand what it is that I'm seeing?
That's exactly it, Jen. Like, right. I was just like, oh, this is really great. It really gives you a broad idea of what's going on. But as an organization, we can really narrow in and possibly do a survey and make it more personal to that area, to really find out what that hotspot is and why those students aren't being served. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe it's strictly a funding issue of teacher access. We hear some of those challenges across the country, that it's not that necessarily schools don't want to provide the arts, they just have barriers to being able to do so. All right, now we're going to take a look at a heat map. So we looked at a couple examples of these last time. So this one is looking at a change from, in this case, 2017-2018 school year to 2020 to 2021. And I want to see if you can figure out, without me saying any more about it, based on your data literacy skills, what we talked about last time, what do you think this blue represents? If somebody wanted you to interpret that cell for them, how would you explain it to them? And it's probably a little more difficult for you all having not seen this dashboard before. And I also kind of hid the text. I'm thinking you can still get what you need in here. So there's some clues in the text, some clues in the titles, maybe your intuition about what this highlight table is about. What do you think? Give you a little bit longer to think on it, and then I'll talk through it with you. We have no volunteers.
I'm practicing stepping back. So any can.
That's great.
I'd say it looks like Bethel it's really the only district on this chart. Clearly, these aren't all the districts that has any kind of a robust dance program.
Yeah.
I mean,
You're
look
right.
at Bethel. You go, Bethel.
You go, Bethel. That's great. Yes, look at that. So in the text, you see that blue is a higher value and orange is lower. So you absorb that. And we see here that we're looking at the enrollment change, and we're looking at dance. So perfect. So yes, the Bethel district had an increase in their dance participation between these years, whereas the other districts shown here did not. In fact, some of them had a decrease. And if you look not just in the dance column, but then look across for the other disciplines at Bethel, they actually had an increase across the board. So you go Bethel indeed. Something was working over there where they had an increase in all of these disciplines, which is really exciting to see, and not always the case, clearly, from what you can see from the other districts in here. Very good. All right, so those are some of the basic chart types that we talked about last time, but we have other chart types that you will encounter in the ArtsEd data project that I wanted to just orient you to and talk through some of the fun findings that we have here as well. So this one is basically just a data table, but instead of giving the raw numbers, I'm using symbols here, in this case squares, to represent whether a course is or isn't offered. So where this is off of our school profile dashboard, where you pick one school at a time and then see a lot of information about the arts program in that school. Which disciplines do they offer? What is the enrollment? What does that look like by grade level? What is their enrollment over time? All kinds of things. And one of the pieces of that is specifically which courses have been offered. So what is something that you're noticing about the year 2020 in particular here? Visual arts prominent, more visual arts. That is true. So if we look at 2020, we picked up a new course here. This advanced placement history of art didn't used to be offered, and now it is as of 2020, or rather it was in 2020 and then not again for 2021. So that's probably an interesting story. We also picked up visual arts drawing too. Wasn't offered before, started being offered, and then it wasn't offered again. We also lost a course. You might have noticed up here in the music, the AP Music Theory was offered, and then it stopped being offered in 2020. Why? Can't say. That's just what the data show. So I chose these squares on purpose because I think it really draws your eye when there's suddenly a gap in it. So if you're scrolling down, right, boom, 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 hey, wait a minute, where'd that course go? Or if you pick one up that you didn't used to have before, that it catches your attention. So a very simple chart type, but I think it can give you a lot of information about what is and isn't offered and has that changed over time. It's really interesting to see when a school suddenly picks up a bunch of new courses. You have to wonder, did they get a bunch more teachers, or how are they able to suddenly offer these courses they weren't able to offer before? And what can we learn from that school potentially that we might be able to apply elsewhere? I use a similar chart type here. This is from the disciplines offered dashboard, where it's a yes, no. So each of these columns is either yes, with the blue circle, they do offer this discipline in this school, or the empty circle, they do not. And then you have the option for all 5 disciplines across the top to say, I want to see the schools that do not, or do or don't offer this discipline. And so you could filter this to all no's if you wanted to see the schools that don't offer any arts, or all yeses to see who offers all of them. But it's a pretty quick way, again, of seeing what is and isn't there in the data. And what I also really like about this chart, even though its primary purpose is to see what a particular school offers, you also start to get a sense of a pattern of the schools as a whole, or relationships between the various disciplines. So for example, if I filter this dashboard to say, yes, show me the schools that do offer dance, you might notice it got awfully blue up in here, that I said yes to dance, but all of these other disciplines tend to be filled in as well. So it turns out that there's a bit of a relationship there, where if a school offers dance, it's very likely it offers these other disciplines as well. But that doesn't work the other direction. If I pick a discipline that's very commonly offered, like music, and say yes to that, I don't necessarily see that same pattern where those schools will also offer these other disciplines. So I think that's a really interesting way to see these relationships between the disciplines, even without it being a chart that's purposefully looking at a correlation or relationship. We talked last time about scatter plots and heat maps and things that do show those relationships. This chart type, that's not what it was meant for primarily, but you can still get that sense from it. So I definitely want to encourage you, as you're interacting with the chart, in addition to thinking about alternative explanations for what could be driving this trend, also think about what other insights can I glean from this chart that maybe I didn't even notice at first. If I start playing with the data or start interacting with the chart, what else can I find out? This one's called a dot strip plot, where we've got one circle representing each county in the state of Washington, and we've got them plotted horizontally in terms of their arts enrollment rate for each of the different disciplines. And you can see, even though it's not distribution in the sense of a histogram like we talked about last time, you still get a sense of what is the shape of the data. So you can see we have this big cluster of counties that have a music enrollment rate up here around 50%-ish. And we've got this other cluster around 30, and another cluster around 15. And we've got these kind of stragglers over here on the low end. And we've got a cluster as well for visual arts around 25. And we've got a couple high achievers, I guess, who have much higher visual arts enrollment rates. So again, it's not truly a distribution chart, or I'm sorry, it's not a histogram the way you might typically think of distribution, but you still get that impression of where do the data points line up, or where do they group up. And you can also see a very typical pattern where, although we have some higher enrollment rates for music and visual arts, we just tend not to see that for theater and dance, because so few schools tend to offer those disciplines. And you see that at every level, the school level, the county level, district level, all of them. Media arts, a little bit more participation here, but less so for some of these other disciplines. And in the interactive version of the dashboard, you can hover over any of these and find out which county that is and what is that exact value. So you don't have to just guess based on the axis. And you can even pick a county and see how it looks on all 5 disciplines simultaneously. So if I've chosen a county on the dashboard, I can see what its rate is for all 5 of these. So you might notice for this particular county that the theater enrollment rate is on the low side in terms of raw numbers, right? It's only something like 5%, but in terms of its performance relative to the other counties, it's actually looking pretty good. So it's all about relativeness here in this particular metric of enrollment rate by discipline. If you compare it to music, yeah, it doesn't look very good. But if you compare it to the other counties, suddenly it does. So you also want to make sure you have an appropriate comparison point to decide, is this a good value or is this not a good value? Do we have all counties reporting? I do believe we have all counties reporting. I'm not as confident we have every single school in every single district in every single county, but we don't have entire counties where we're missing data. A few more dot strip plots. You'll see these throughout the dashboards. I really like this type of data display. So we have them in several places. This is on the comparisons dashboard. This is on the district level dashboard. It's a lot of data points if you don't first select a district. So this dashboard is about picking your district and then seeing the schools within it. So this is every school in there, but it's definitely more meaningful once you look at a district at a time. And then this is also a dot strip plot. It's just been kind of stretched out so you can more easily see, I'm sorry, stretched out this way. So the dots don't all line up on top of each other. You get a better sense of where those data points are. We won't go through each and every one of these, but just wanted to point out that we use those a lot in the project. I do want to talk a little bit more about this one though, because this is another one where I think when people first encounter this visualization, they maybe don't realize just how rich it is in terms of all the different things you can glean from it. So this is a chart where we've got each school as its own blue dot, and we've got them arranged horizontally within their district, and then we've also got them grouped by county. So you can see within a district, the different schools and sort of the distribution of the arts enrollment rate within that district. You can also compare the districts to each other. So I don't know if you notice these lines here, and I actually have some color shading. It's a little hard to see in the PowerPoint, but this is a little bit kind of pinkish color. And it shows where that average is within the district and the schools that fall below it and the schools that fall above it. And so you can see school level, district level, you can also kind of get a general sense for the counties. There's a lot going on in there. And it gets really interesting, I think, to kind of a good exercise in how do different data points affect the overall picture. If we look at an example like these 2 districts that are both in King County, we have Renton and Riverview, and their district average is about the same. They're both in the high 70s. But if you look at the school level information, you might notice that Renton district has some schools way down here where their arts enrollment rate is pretty low. In fact, this one's 0, less than 20%. We have several of those. And this district doesn't have any of those. And yet their averages end up to be in about the same place. Any thoughts on what does this tell us about the data points that these 2 district level values could be so similar, even though we've got very different school level values? Anybody have a hypothesis on that? Let's think about, these are school level factors, but the enrollment rate is based on the number of students participating out of the number in the school. So one possibility is that these schools up here in Renton School District are maybe larger schools. So their total number of students participating is pulling up, if you will, this average for the district and kind of washing out the effect of these schools. Maybe these are smaller schools. So yeah, it's a 0%, but maybe there's only 50 kids in that school. Whereas maybe these are very large schools. And so when you put all of these numerators of the number of kids participating over all the denominator of the students in the district, these bigger schools with their high enrollment rate can basically counteract these smaller schools with a lower enrollment rate. That's one possibility for what might be going on here, and help explain why this district value is overall so high, even though a few of the schools within it have a low enrollment rate. So another example of how on the surface, right, there's some lines, there's some dots, here's some schools, but if you really think about what is this telling me about the data and how can it be that this district level looks so different from this other district, you can actually get a lot out of this. Riverview and Renton have very overall different enrollment rates. Renton is big, Riverview is small. I would have guessed that just based on looking at the data. Thank you for confirming that. All
Yeah, I
right.
really like what Sophia has to say too, is that maybe they are more interested in sports or STEM at that school and more focused. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. There could be various reasons why the arts participation is low, because maybe the students are doing other important, cool things. Doesn't necessarily mean that the students aren't getting quality activities and participation at their school. It's just not arts. So good point there. This chart type is called a Cleveland dot plot, and this is on our county level dashboard. So you see here, we're looking at the top 10 and the bottom 10 counties in Washington based on the metric I have chosen. So we have 5 showing, but I've selected students without access. So this is students who attend a school that does not offer the arts at all. And we want that to be a low number, right? We want our students to have access to the arts. And so you see that even though the dot is on the left side, closer to 0%, it's given the blue or desirable value because that's exactly what we want. We want our students to have access. So depending on the metric that you choose, these counties will reorganize. And in fact, the list of counties will change potentially, because the same county that's doing well on one metric may not necessarily be a county that's doing well in all metrics. In fact, we see that with your data here. Some of you may already have noticed that although we're looking at the top 3 on this metric, students without access, we see some red up here for these same counties. So I think that's really interesting about this, that you take a county like Columbia, and they're doing really well on making sure their students have access to the arts, but they're not doing very well. In fact, they're completely not achieving their objectives of providing the arts that are required by your state. And none of the students have access to the number of disciplines that they should be getting access to. So the disciplines they do have access to that participate pretty high. Their arts enrollment rate looks to be around 60% or so. That's a reasonably high rate, but they don't have access to the ones they should have. So another example of so much information can really be gleaned from these charts if you really dig in and look at it in all these possible different ways. You can see within a metric, you can see across a metric to look at how a particular county is doing. And some counties do really well in all areas, some are doing poorly in all areas, and some it's highs and lows. They're doing well in some ways, but not in all of them. I think that's really fascinating. I just wanted to mention that we do have some chart types just to kind of keep things interesting. So we have some metrics that are really important to the project, like what is the arts enrollment rate? What proportion of the students are participating? So that's a big one. And then also what proportion of students do not have access to the arts? That's kind of our 2 big metrics of the project. So we have what we call these big aggregated numbers periodically throughout the dashboards to really draw your attention to kind of this key fact. Is there a question?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah.
I wanted to know what the graph name is of the previous one that we just saw.
Oh, the Cleveland dot plot.
The Cleveland dot plot. I really like it. Thank you.
I do too. Yeah. Glad you enjoyed it as
Really
well.
easy to read for me. I like it. Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. And then sometimes we'll just put in some icons. They're not necessary, but just to keep things a little interesting. And I mean, it's fun, right? Art should be a fun topic. So sometimes you'll see just a little bit of extra shapes and color, not excessively, but in a few places just to be interesting. And also I did want to point out, I found this really interesting for your state, that theater enrollment is predominantly females. Most of the students who are in theater are female students. that's not necessarily the case for every state. So I thought that was interesting finding. All right, so we have just a little bit of time left. I wanted to just very quickly show you, I've been mentioning some of these dashboards as I show you a screenshot of one chart from them, but also just want to orient you to all of the different displays that we have. Don't have time today to do a full demo. And as I said, we're hoping to release these somewhat soon. I know things are still in review, but we're getting there. And I just want you to be aware that there's a lot of content out there for you. So I'm going to jump over here into our server. So this will go on your web page eventually. Right now, it lives on our server. But first thing you'll see is we have a table of contents that tells you all the different dashboards available, a little description of each of them, a little tiny picture of what that will look like to give you a sense of, if I go here, what content can I expect to find? So we've got all of that. We do have a demo video that talks through how to use the dashboards. Where do I click on? How do I filter things? So that's all covered in that brief video. And you can go to any of the dashboards directly from here or the tabs at the top. So I do recommend, if it's your first time coming into the dashboards, to start with the instructions and info, because, oops, gotta reconnect. I let it sit idle too long. We were doing all of our other content. It's gotta reestablish. 1 second here. The instructions and info just goes through some helpful tips on how to interact with the dashboards. What are some of those key definitions, those kinds of things. So if you're new to this, I do recommend starting there. You can kind of get a iconography lesson of what do these different things mean. That's the filter. Here's the definitions down here. So good place to start. But then once you are ready to start digging into the content, it just is up to you in terms of what draws your attention. So we have our overview dashboard, which are kind of big picture. What does things look like at the state level? We've got specific to the county, district. There's the school profile that I mentioned before, where you can pick any school that provided data, and any year as well. We show up to the most recent 5 years available and get a sense of which disciplines does the school offer, what is the enrollment rate in each of them, how many teachers do they have in each of these disciplines, how many courses. This is where we did that exercise of which courses. In this case, they've had complete stability in the courses offered. So that school profile, I mentioned the No Arts dashboard, where we've got a trend of what does that rate look like. It's gotten better in Washington. That's really encouraging. So although the current rate of 12.4% of students who don't have access to the arts isn't maybe the best number that you might all have hoped for, it's considerably better than it used to be. And I think it's important to celebrate those wins and successes where you have them. May not be where you want to be yet, but you're heading in that direction. I think that's fantastic. Here's that map we looked at of where are those schools. Some of these should look really familiar. I've been showing these examples to you throughout our session today. So here's some of those big numbers at the top where we just give you that key information right away, and then you can dig in a little bit further. We've got a dashboard called Course Finder that's specifically geared to answer basically one of two questions. In which schools is this course offered? Or which courses does this school offer? So if you wanted to know about the course level, you could go select it from here, say, I'm really interested in animation, pick it, and there we go. There's the schools in the state that offer animation. And I can already see I need to fix that so that the map updates. This map should have filtered to show you just those schools. Wouldn't be a demo without something needing to be fixed. Or if you're interested in a particular school, you can say, let's see, I can tell that Harbor Junior Senior High has 6 courses. I wonder what those are. Click it. There's the school, there's the courses, boom. So this one is built to answer very specific questions, but it is just kind of interesting to see where the different courses are clustered as well. Let's see, I want to point out the disciplines offered. So I showed you the simple chart here at the bottom with all the different filters. I also want to point out that it does bucket each of the schools into how many disciplines does it offer. So you can see the 0, 1, 2, and so on. So that's kind of an interesting distribution of what the data looks like in Washington in terms of how many disciplines are being offered. So sorry, we don't have time to go through every single piece of the dashboard. We do have that functionality video, but hopefully this gives you a little bit of a preview and maybe some excitement generating about when you have access to these dashboards, just how many things you can look at and all the different questions you'll be able to answer when you see it. But I want to finish our session today with just a couple of notes about some of the limitations of the data. So project is pretty robust. We have great information out there. You will be able to answer some questions, but it's not perfect, right? The project is only as good as the data we get. And so we have talked a couple of times today about how it's completely reliant on the information that we get from your state Department of Education. So if the schools are not fully reporting the arts that they actually offer, or if they don't submit a teacher, or whatever they don't completely report, then we don't get that information either. So if there's underreporting or data quality problems that aren't corrected, then those manifest in the data displays as well. Data granularity, we talked about this in our first session, where if the data, oh goodness. Sorry, that just completely, let me stop sharing here for a second and see if it comes back. I tried to get that notification out of our way and it scrambled my screen. Oh no. Well, I might just have to talk about these verbally with you. Apologies. There we go. I think I got it back. Hold on. Goodness. Last time I lost my voice. This time I lost my screen. It's always something.
You're doing great. Don't worry.
Thanks. Appreciate the support.
The knowledge you carry is so impressive. So it's
good deal. Thanks, Jody. Appreciate that. Okay, so as I was saying, data granularity, we only are getting aggregated data from Washington currently. So some of those displays I showed you where you could pick different characteristics of the students, like their race and their grade and their special education participation, we're not going to be able to do that with Washington data yet. But hopefully we'll get there in the near future. And the more granular the data, the more in-depth the questions we'll be able to answer. It's only about arts information. You all probably have lots of other things you'd like to know, such as, do our music students also participate in STEM courses? Unfortunately, we don't have that information available. All we know is about, are they in the arts and which courses, but nothing about the rest of their course load.
And Jen, can I ask, what kind of information do you guys need in order to survey special education?
Well, the other states who provided that have just given us basically a yes, no. It's a flag in the data of this student is participating or not. We don't usually get a lot of detail about the specifics of that, but even just that level of detail, they are or they aren't, is still really informative to be able to look at how that relates to their arts participation, for example.
And so Washington State did not provide that information?
They didn't, because they only gave us aggregated data. So they said, here's how many students are in this course, but not any details about those particular students, including their special education or their race or anything about the students themselves.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, hopefully a goal for the future. We would love to see your state and other states.
It's another phone.
Yeah, add it to the action list.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to point out these are point in time information. So I'm actually not certain if your state is giving us data as of the beginning of the school year or the end, but either way, it's one point in time. So if a student started a course and dropped it, we may still be counting them as being in it if the drop happened after the data were pulled. Or conversely, if they you get the idea. So it's all point in time. If something changed for them throughout the year. In fact, if they moved to a different district, there's another example. We only know what district they were in at the time the data were pulled. So that's just something to be aware of when you're looking at the displays. And we don't have any sense of quality or depth. So we can say they're in the course, or they were as of the date when the data were pulled, but we don't know if their teacher is a certified teacher, although we're working on that as well for your state. We don't know if the student is really engaged in the course. They're getting great grades. They're doing well on their tests. They're super enthused. We just know they're in it. We don't have a lot of depth to the data. Maybe something we could aspire to later in the project as well. And then finally, we're not able to answer the why. So you'll see trends and patterns and things that you might have all kinds of questions about. And maybe there's some things you can find elsewhere in the dashboard that will help start to answer that. But you probably are not going to ever get to the total, this is why we're seeing this. It's just too limited of a data set, and there's too many possibilities for why things happen. And we can't really tell you, even if you see that two things are related, that one is causing the other. So again, lots of things you can answer, but not everything that we may wish that we could answer with these data. And with that, we've reached the end of our session. So we looked at some charts from Washington for the project and interpreted them. I did a super brief demo, and then we talked a little bit about those limitations. So before our session 4, I want to get a sense from you all. I have an interactive activity you all could do on your own, where you will be interacting with some dashboards and then get some multiple choice questions to kind of test your knowledge of it. Would that be something you all be interested in doing? Because I could send you a link to that. Okay, I'm seeing some interest. If you don't participate, that's up to you. But if some of you might want to, I'm happy to make that available. So that's what we'll do before next time. I'll send that out. If you want to participate, you can. Otherwise, hopefully we'll see you all back here next week to talk about chart limitations, biases, misconceptions, etc. How to be a critical consumer of data. Let's think of it that way.
Love that. Well, thank you so much, Jen. Thank you. This was really informative and really interesting. I'm super excited for the dashboard and all of the data that's going to be coming out later this month or later this summer. And giving us that data literacy is so key to being able to read this. So thank you so much. And for you that are just joining us, please join us next week, our last session on June 26th at 1:30 p.m. Thank you all so much and see you soon. Bye.